She had built a fortress of silence so impenetrable that everyone in the mountains swore her voice had been stolen, until a stranger began to mend her soul using nothing but seeds and black soil. Can you imagine the sheer magnitude of pain required for a person to decide they will never utter another word, preferring the company of dead roots to any human being? But this story of silent rescue began to bloom in the autumn of 1924, in the frost-bitten Mist Valley, high up in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Before we dive into the secrets of this forgotten garden, go ahead and hit the like button. Subscribe to the Tales of Yesteryear channel and let me know in the comments which city you're watching from, because I read every single one of them. The wind that May morning cut through the valley, carrying a thick fog that swallowed the tops of the Fraser firs and turned the landscape into a canvas painted in shades of grey and melancholy. Inside the rustic stone cottage, the loneliness was so dense it could almost be touched. Aurora stood by the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around an enameled tin mug, radiating the heat of freshly brewed coffee. The strong scent of beans roasted on the wood-burning stove mingled with the aroma of soot and burnt pine, creating the only comfort she allowed herself. Her hazel eyes, marked by deep circles that told stories of sleepless nights, watched the grounds outside through glass fogged by her own breath. The yard, which had once been her late grandfather's greatest pride, was now a botanical graveyard. It was a rare floral clock, a massive circle drawn in the earth, where different species of flowers had been planted to bloom at exact hours of the day, tracking the sun's journey. Now, the circle was swallowed by aggressive weeds, twisted briars, and dry vines that strangled any promise of life. Aurora took a sip of the bitter coffee, feeling the hot liquid slide down a throat that hadn't emitted a single sound for 5 long years. She wasn't born mute, nor had any illness robbed her of speech. Her silence was a choice, a lead shield forged in the deepest pain a soul could endure. In 1919, in the gilded ballrooms of Charleston, she possessed a voice that enchanted crowds. She was a rising operatic soprano, the jewel of her family, but her gift became her curse when her own older brother, Vincent, drowning in gambling debts to dangerous men, decided to use her as a bargaining chip. Vincent had forged documents and signed an arranged marriage contract, selling his sister to a cruel, violent creditor who wished to display the beautiful singer like a trophy in his mansion. When Aurora discovered the betrayal, hours before being forced to sign the marriage papers, something inside her chest shattered with the violence of crystal hurled against stone. She fled in the dead of night, catching the first freight train toward the mountains of North Carolina, seeking the only refuge Vincent couldn't easily take from her, her grandfather's abandoned old cabin in Mist Valley. Since that day, Aurora had made a silent vow to the universe. If the world, and especially the men in her life, only wanted to hear her, to take advantage of her charm, she would deprive them of her greatest gift. She would never speak again. She would never sing again. She let silence take over her home, her mind and her heart, passively watching as her grandfather's floral clock died outside, mirroring the exact condition of her own soul. Loneliness was a high price, but the security of not being hurt again was worth every second of that voluntary exile. As Aurora watched the mist slowly dissipate, the low rumble of a luxury automobile engine tore through the valley's habitual silence, making her heart leap in her chest. Engines were rare around there, reserved only for wealthy landowners or tax collectors. She hid behind the heavy, faded velvet curtain, peeking through a slit. On the neighboring property, separated from her land only by a low wall of stacked stones covered in moss, a sleek black car had just pulled in. A man stepped out of the vehicle. He wore an impeccably tailored dark wool suit, an elegant knee-length overcoat, and a felt fedora that shaded part of his face. His posture was straight, but there was a visible weight on his shoulders, as if he carried the entire world on his back. Behind him, a grey-haired lady with kind features climbed out of the car, complaining about the cold, rubbing her arms, and directing the driver regarding the luggage. The man was Heitor, a renowned master watchmaker from the nation's capital. His hands, protected by fine, dark leather gloves, were famous for repairing the most complex, delicate, and expensive mechanisms of high society. But what good was a talent for fixing time if he couldn't stop the clock on the life of the only person he ever loved? His wife had passed away suddenly 6 months ago, the victim of a silent aneurysm that took her in her sleep. After the funeral, Heitor tried to return to work, but the sound of the clocks in his workshop became unbearable torture. The continuous ticking, the spinning gears, the swinging pendulums, everything reminded him that time marched on relentlessly, while his heart had stopped beating the exact minute he found his wife lifeless. On the verge of a breakdown, fleeing the deafening noise of the city and the hollow condolences of his wealthy clients, Heitor instructed his lawyers to buy the quietest, most isolated property they could find in the rural backcountry. That was how he landed in Mist Valley. Heitor stood in the middle of the lawn of his new property, took off his hat, and breathed in deeply. The freezing air filled his lungs with the scent of wet earth and fallen pine needles. The absolute silence of the mountain was exactly what he needed. Mrs. Celeste, his loyal housekeeper, who refused to leave him alone in the middle of nowhere, approached him, lightly touching her employer's arm and saying in a motherly tone that the house was very cold, and he needed to go inside before he fell ill. Heitor merely nodded with a sad smile, but before turning toward the door, his eyes were drawn to the neighboring property. He walked slowly to the low stone wall. The overgrown brush in the neighboring yard looked like mere neglect to the average person, but Heitor was a man trained to see order in chaos, to find logical patterns where others saw only loose gears. His eyes swept across the circular terrain, and he immediately recognized the geometry of the destruction. There was a main bed in the center from which 12 rays radiated, dividing the earth into 12 identical sections. He noticed the remains of stalks belonging to 4 o'clocks, plants that used to open punctually in the late afternoon, beside the rotted roots of morning glories, famous for blooming with the first rays of dawn. A Linnaean floral clock, a perfect and complex botanical mechanism that marked the hours by the movement of petals. But the clock was broken, dead. The compulsion of his profession tingled in his fingertips. Seeing something so brilliant in such a state of abandonment caused the watchmaker physical pain. It was then that Heitor lifted his gaze from the dead plants to the stone cottage. At the kitchen window, partially hidden by the shadow and the old curtain, he saw a pale, startled face. Aurora's hazel eyes met Heitor's dark, weary ones. The world around them seemed to stop for a fraction of a second. There were no waves, no welcoming smiles. There was only the immediate, silent recognition of 2 souls sharing the same language of grief and isolation. Frightened at being noticed, Aurora let go of the curtain quickly, disappearing into the darkness of the house like a haunted apparition. Heitor remained standing by the wall for long minutes, feeling a curiosity he hadn't experienced in months pulsing through his veins. That same afternoon, Heitor took the car and drove down the winding dirt road to the small mountain village to buy supplies. At the general store, while choosing bags of coffee, sugar, and some gardening tools, the shopkeeper, Mr. Oswald, a man with a prominent belly and a loose tongue, struck up a conversation. While packing the groceries, the merchant noticed Heitor's gaze lingering on the hoes and shovels and immediately began talking about the neighborhood. The man leaned over the counter and, in a conspiratorial tone, warned Heitor to keep his distance from the stone cottage. Mr. Oswald told him that the woman living there was completely touched in the head, a reclusive mute who wouldn't open the door for anyone, didn't answer calls, and who, according to rumors, had lost her mind after being jilted at the altar. The merchant insisted she was as skittish as a wild animal, and that the high grass of her property was a den of snakes. Heitor listened to it all in silence. He took the heavy bundle of tools, paid the bill with crisp new bills that made the merchant's eyes gleam, and thanked him politely before leaving, ignoring every word of the warning. He knew how to tell the difference between madness and profound sadness. The face he had seen in the window wasn't that of a crazy woman, but of a bird trapped in a cage she had locked herself. Night fell over the valley, bringing a light frost that painted the leaves white. Aurora tossed and turned in her wooden bed, wrapped in heavy blankets, unable to sleep. The presence of the man on the adjacent lot disturbed her. In recent years, every neighbor who had tried to approach eventually gave up in the face of her stone-cold silence. But that man in the expensive suit had looked at her differently. He didn't seem to judge her or feel pity. He seemed to understand her. When the sun finally began to pierce the pre-dawn darkness, bathing the valley in a golden cold light, Aurora got up. She put on her grey wool coat, prepared her coffee in silence, and went to her post by the window, secretly hoping to see the neighboring property empty, praying the black car had already left. But the car was there, and worse yet, Heitor was outside. Aurora's heart raced when she saw the tall man approaching the stone wall. He was no longer wearing the elegant overcoat, but rather a white cotton shirt with sleeves rolled up to his elbows, dark twill trousers, and heavy leather boots. In one hand, he carried a brand-new hoe, its metal gleaming in the morning light. In the other, a zinc bucket and small pruning shears. He stopped before the wall that divided the lots. Aurora held her breath, taking a step back into the shadows of the kitchen. What was he doing? Was he going to knock on the door? Was he going to demand she clean up the mess on her land that was encroaching on his fence? She felt her hands sweat, the old panic rising in her mute throat. But Heitor didn't walk toward the cottage door. He didn't shout a good morning. He didn't ask for permission. With an agile, silent movement, the wealthy widower hopped over the stone wall and stepped onto Aurora's land. He walked with firm steps to the quadrant of the old floral clock that corresponded to 6 in the morning. He set the bucket on the ground, knelt directly on the damp, frost-covered earth, not caring about his expensive trousers getting soiled with black mud, and drove the hoe into the hard soil. Aurora's eyes widened, the sound of metal slicing through the compacted earth and tearing the stubborn roots of weeds echoed through the silent valley. It was a rustic, violent, and strangely liberating sound. For 2 whole hours, as the sun rose on the horizon melting the frost, Heitor worked without rest. Sweat began to stain the back of his light shirt. His hands, accustomed to the delicate touch of Swiss precision tweezers, now gripped thorny branches and pulled tufts of dead brush with impressive strength. He cleared the entire eastern quadrant of the circle, piling the debris into the zinc bucket. He didn't look at the window once. He didn't seek recognition. When fatigue finally seemed to overcome him, he gathered his tools, hopped the wall back to his property, and disappeared inside the luxury house. The lonely woman let her breath escape in a trembling sigh. Her legs weakened, and she had to lean against the edge of the stone sink. The patch of earth he had cleared contrasted dramatically with the rest of the chaotic yard. The black soil, now overturned and breathing under the morning sun, looked like a clean, open wound. Why did he do it? Confusion dominated Aurora's thoughts for the rest of the day. She paced back and forth in the narrow living room, hugging her own shoulders. He was an intruder, she tried to convince herself. He was a rich man who felt entitled to invade someone else's land. She should throw stones, she should push him away, she should scare him off. But when night came, the scent of the tilled earth drifted through her window, and for the first time in 5 years, Aurora slept without having nightmares about her brother. The next day, at exactly the same time, when the mist was still dragging its white shroud across the ground, the sound of the hoe cut through the silence again. There was Heitor. the same wrinkled white shirt, the same focused face. This time he attacked the 8 o'clock quadrant, ripping out the deep roots of a parasitic vine that had strangled the old miniature rose bushes. Aurora watched everything from the window, her coffee growing cold in the forgotten mug on the table. She noticed how the muscles in his arms tensed with every strike against the hard earth. She noticed the heavy breath condensing in the cold air, and, most importantly, she noticed that at no point did he act as if he were doing a favor. He worked with the devotion of someone who needed that earth as much as the earth needed him. An entire week passed in this same methodical rhythm. Gradually, Aurora's suspicion and fear began to give way to a fascinated curiosity. The silence between them wasn't oppressive, like the silence of her loneliness. It was an inhabited silence, comfortable, filled with the rhythmic sound of labor and care. The floral clock was beginning to take shape again, at least in its earthen structure. The original circle was now perfectly visible, with its 12 well-defined slices, patiently awaiting new seeds. On the 8th day of intense work, the botanical tragedy took its toll on the watchmaker's uncalloused hands. While trying to pull out a deeply rooted thorny bush, Heiter slipped in the mud. His unprotected fingers slid down the thick stem, and the thorns tore the skin of his right palm. He let out a dull groan, falling to his knees. Aurora, watching from the window, took a step forward, pressing her face and palms against the cold glass. Her heart gave a painful jolt in her chest. Instinct almost made her run outside, almost made her open the door to help him, but the invisible chains of her trauma kept her nailed to the kitchen floorboards. Heiter looked at his own bloody hand. He stood up slowly, wiped the blood on his already filthy trousers, and for the first time since he had started working in the garden, he lifted his face directly toward Aurora's window. He didn't have an expression of pain or anger. His face wore a small smile, a silent apology for having ruined the morning's tranquility. He left his mud-caked leather gloves and tools on top of the stone wall and walked back to his house, clutching his injured hand to his chest. That night, the darkness in Mist Valley was total, punctuated only by the distant glow of icy stars. Silence reigned, but inside Aurora's cottage, a silent storm was brewing. She stared at the stone wall through the window. Heitor's leather gloves and his small garden trowel were still there, abandoned in the night dew. Something deep and ancient stirred in the woman's chest. An empathy she thought was dead. With hesitant steps, she unbolted the front door of her house. The sound of the rusted iron latch felt like thunder in the silence of the night. The freezing air cut across her face. She walked barefoot across the damp grass, feeling the cold rise through her ankles, and reached the wall. With trembling hands, she gathered the mud-caked gloves and the trowel. Inside the house, Aurora heated water on the wood-burning stove. With a piece of lye soap and a soft brush, she washed the leather of the gloves with almost reverent care. The water in the metal basin turned brown with the earth he had removed from her yard. Then she polished the metal of the trowel with a cotton cloth until the tool gleamed, reflecting the orange light of the stove's flames. She dried the gloves near the fire, stretching the leather so it wouldn't shrink from the heat. Before the sun rose, Aurora crept back to the wall and placed the clean tools in the exact spot where Heitor had left them. That was the first step of a silent dance. She hadn't uttered a single word, but she had just told him that she saw him, that she thanked him, and that, in some way, she accepted his presence. When Heitor woke the next morning, his hand bandaged by Mrs. Celeste, his intention was merely to assess the work that remained. But upon reaching the low wall and looking at the moss-covered stones, his footsteps halted. The watchmaker's heart skipped a beat. His leather gloves were there, soft, clean, and smelling of homemade soap and wood smoke. The trowel gleamed under the first rays of sun. Heitor looked at the neighboring cottage. The kitchen window curtain flickered slightly, giving away that someone had just hidden behind it. An unknown warmth flooded the widower's chest, melting some of the thick ice that the loss of his wife had created in his soul. She had responded, without letters, without a voice, without demands, only with an act of pure care. Heitor knew he had to respond in the same tone, in the same delicate frequency that wouldn't startle the wounded bird living in that stone house. He wouldn't use notes or exaggerated waves. He would use the only language that mattered on that piece of land, floriography, the ancient and complex language of flowers he had studied years ago in old French books. Over the next 2 days, Heitor didn't hop the wall. He worked in his own garden, preparing seedlings in small clay pots he had brought from the city. Aurora watched his absence from her land with a strange mix of relief and a sharp pang of disappointment. Had she done something wrong? Had touching his things offended him? Old insecurities began to whisper in her mind, those horrible voices from her past, saying she always ruined everything around her. But at dawn on the 3rd day, she found the answer. Opening the weathered wooden door to get some firewood from the porch, Aurora stopped abruptly, her breath caught in her throat. On the first wooden step of her cottage entrance sat a small, freshly watered clay pot. The black, damp earth smelled of new life. Planted in the center of the pot, displaying its delicate and deeply aromatic flowers, was a perfect purple hyacinth. The small bell-shaped flowers hung in an abundant cluster, and the vibrant color tore through the gray monotony of the mountain autumn. Aurora knelt on the step, feeling her coarse skirt scrape against the cold wood. She brought her hands to her face as her eyes filled with warm tears that overflowed silently down her pale cheeks. She knew the language of flowers. Her grandfather had taught her everything about the hidden meanings of every petal when they built the floral clock together. The purple hyacinth carried an ancient, universal, and painfully specific meaning in the world of romantic botany. It meant deep sorrow. It meant a plea for forgiveness. It meant, "Please forgive me for my intrusion and my haste." With hands trembling with emotion, she picked up the pot, pressing the cold clay against her chest, and breathed in the sweet, intoxicating scent of the flower. For the first time in half a decade, Aurora didn't feel like a broken object or spoiled merchandise. She felt cared for. The man in the expensive suit had invaded her loneliness, had dirtied his hands and bled on her land, and yet he was the one asking for forgiveness with a delicacy she thought no longer existed in the world of men. She carried the hyacinth inside, placing it in the center of the kitchen table, the place of highest honor in her small, lonely castle. The first bridge had been built. The foundation of trust was laid in the wet earth of the valley. The relationship that began to grow between them in the following weeks was something no inhabitant of the village would understand. It was an intimate conversation shouted in the most absolute silence. Every day, Heitor left a seedling at the wall. When he planted small lilies of the valley in the morning section, Aurora knew he wished her the return of happiness. When he left white clover seeds, he was offering a silent promise, and Aurora responded. When the morning was too freezing, she left a steaming cup of sweet coffee on the stone wall before he arrived, retreating quickly before being seen up close. Heitor drank the coffee, feeling the heat warm his hands and his heart, washed the cup in the nearby stream, and returned it accompanied by a new, clean tool. The floral clock was coming back to life. The weeds had given way to fertilized earth, and small green shoots already dotted the 12 quadrants. Their routine became the very pulse of that forgotten valley's heart. The pains of the past hadn't disappeared, but the constant, non-intrusive company of one another was acting as a powerful balm on their scars. Heitor no longer heard the maddening ticking of the city clocks. He now guided his day by the opening and closing of the flowers belonging to the woman next door. and Aurora no longer heard the echoes of her brother's betrayal, replaced by the constant and comforting sound of the hoe in the earth. Trust had taken deep root, but like any young and fragile plant, it was about to face its first great winter storm. Late on a particularly cloudy Tuesday afternoon, while Aurora was kneeling in the yard with dirt-stained fingers, she had finally gathered the courage to plant her own seeds alongside the ones Hator left. The noisy rumble of a different engine broke the valley's peace. It wasn't Hator's luxurious, quiet car. It was the sputtering sound of a mail truck from the city. The vehicle skidded to a halt in the mud in front of the cottage's rotting wooden gate. The mailman hopped out, honking impatiently. Aurora felt her stomach drop and the blood drain from her face. She backed toward the stone wall of her house, trying to merge with the shadow. Hator, who was on his porch having tea with Mrs. Celeste, stood up abruptly upon seeing his neighbor's distress, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding. The mailman, accustomed to local legends and terrified of the crazy mute, didn't dare enter the property. He simply tossed a thick brown paper envelope over the wooden fence and shouted that he needed a signature of receipt, but since he got no response other than the woman's terrified silence, he sped away, leaving dust and the smell of exhaust to stain the pure mountain air. Aurora remained paralyzed for several minutes after the vehicle left. Her legs wouldn't obey her brain's commands. With short, faltering steps, she walked to the gate and picked up the envelope lying in the dirt. Her hands shook violently as she turned the mail over. The sender was a dark red wax seal she would recognize even in the dark. It was the wax seal of the law office in downtown Charleston, the office that handled the family's business, her brother Vincent's office. Hator watched from afar as the woman's legs gave way and she fell to her knees on the thin grass, clutching the envelope to her chest while her shoulders shook in soundless sobbing, a mute despair that echoed louder than any scream of pain the watchmaker had ever heard. Without thinking, Hator walked hurriedly to the wall. He was about to hop it, about to break the safe physical distance they had built to support her, but Aurora lifted her red, terror-filled eyes to him. She shook her head no, a quick, desperate gesture, a silent plea for him not to cross the line, for him not to involve himself in the darkness that had just found its way back to her refuge. She grabbed the letter, stood up, stumbling on her own skirt, and ran inside the cottage, slamming the heavy wooden door and bolting it shut. Hator remained at the wall, his hands gripping the rough stones until his knuckles turned white. The garden was only half finished, the trust only beginning to bud, and suddenly the cruel winter of Aurora's past had returned with full force, threatening to freeze all the flowers before they even had a chance to open for the morning sun. The clock was ticking, and for the first time since he had arrived at the mountain, the watchmaker felt afraid that this woman's time for healing was about to end violently. The true test of their silent rescue was only just beginning. The sound of the brown paper being torn seemed deafening inside the stone cottage, echoing off the cold walls like the crack of a whip in the freezing mountain air. Aurora sat on the uneven wooden floor of the living room. Her back pressed against the front door, she had bolted shut, as if the thick wood could stop the world's malice from invading her sanctuary. Her fingers, still soiled with the black, damp earth of the garden that was beginning to be reborn, shook uncontrollably as she unfolded the pages, typed with the cold, impersonal black ink of the Charleston law office. The scent of the paper carried the metallic, suffocating odor of the big city, a smell of train smoke, cheap cigars, and boundless ambition, the exact smell that belonged to her brother. The weak, late afternoon light, filtered by the heavy autumn clouds of 1924, illuminated the cruel words that danced before her terrified hazel eyes. The mail wasn't an apology, much less an attempt at reconciliation. It was a sentence of condemnation, dictated by the greed of a man who saw his own sister as nothing more than a financial obstacle. The letter informed her, in cold and calculating legal terms, that the expansion of the Southern Railway had charted a new route that would cross the base of the Blue Ridge Mountains, passing exactly through the lands of Mist Valley. Her late grandfather's plot, which for years wasn't worth more than a few copper coins and the sweat of whoever tilled it, had overnight become a gold mine in the eyes of capital investors. Vincent, mired in new gambling debts that threatened not only his reputation but his very life at the hands of dangerous creditors, needed to sell the property immediately. However, the deed was in Aurora's name. Since she didn't respond to previous letters and maintained her mute exile, her brother had taken drastic measures. The document stated that Vincent had filed a legal petition to have her declared incompetent, claiming that her hysterical muteness, extreme isolation, and refusal to live in society were irrefutable proof of mental insanity. The letter established a cruel deadline, informing her that in a few weeks he would arrive at the mountain accompanied by an evaluating physician and local authorities to forcibly remove her to an asylum in the city, thereby assuming total control of her assets. Air vanished from Aurora's lungs, as if an invisible lead hand was squeezing her throat. Her vision darkened at the edges as pure panic flooded her veins, making her heart beat at a frantic pace against her ribs. She crumpled the papers against her chest, huddling on the floor in a fetal position. The sobbing that racked her body was mute, a silent agony that twisted her muscles and spilled thick, warm tears that stained the rough fabric of her grey dress. The trauma of 5 years ago, the night she discovered she had been sold as a commodity to pay her brother's debts, returned with the force of an avalanche. She had fled, she had abdicated her voice, her art, her future, just to have peace. She had built a fortress of silence, believing that invisibility would be her salvation. But malice does not respect silence, it devours it. The thought of being dragged from her refuge, of being thrown into a white room in an asylum, surrounded by strangers who would force her to speak and treat her like a sick animal, was a fate 1,000 times worse than death. She felt the cold of the floorboards penetrate her bones, believing that all the progress she had made, all the hope that had begun to sprout with the help of the silent neighbor, was about to be crushed under the boots of greed. On the other side of the moss-covered stone wall, Heitor paced back and forth in his luxurious library, his heavy steps making the oak floorboards groan beneath his leather boots. The lit fireplace crackled in the corner of the room, radiating a heat that couldn't reach the cold that had settled in the watchmaker's chest. Through his window, he had seen the mail truck arrive, seen the correspondence tossed with contempt, and witnessed the absolute collapse of the woman next door. The image of her falling to her knees in the dirt, clutching that envelope as if it were a blade driven into her own body, was burned into his retinas. He had wanted to hop the wall, wanted to break down her door, and wrap his arms around her, offering the protection his money and status could buy. But the look she gave him, a look of paralyzing terror that begged for distance, had frozen him in place. He was a man who fixed mechanisms, who adjusted microscopic springs and delicate gears. He knew perfectly well that when a mechanism is under maximum tension, forcing a gear can break the entire system. If he invaded her house in that moment of panic, he wouldn't be a savior. He would be just another man imposing his will on her space. He had to respect the limit, even if it cost him his own peace of mind. That night, the mountain sky closed in completely, pouring down a fine, freezing rain that turned the garden soil into a dark mire. Heitor couldn't close his eyes. The sound of rain droplets hitting his bedroom window felt like the ticking of a clock, marking the seconds toward an imminent tragedy. He went downstairs in silence, avoiding waking Mrs. Celeste, put on his heavy wool overcoat, laced up his waterproof boots, and grabbed a kerosene lantern. He walked to his glass greenhouse, a heated annex he'd had built at the back of the property, where the air smelled of fertile earth and wet leaves. Walking among the wooden benches lined with pots, the watchmaker searched meticulously for the exact answer he needed to give to Aurora's pain. On the highest shelf, under the flickering light of the lantern, he found what he was looking for. It was a vigorous, robust stalk of red gladiolus, a flower with tall stems and leaves as sharp as swords. In the ancient language of floriography, the gladiolus didn't carry promises of soft romance or passing friendship. The sword lily signified strength of character, unshakable integrity, and readiness for battle. It meant, "I am armed and ready to fight for you. Do not give up." Protecting the small clay pot against his chest under his overcoat, Heitor walked through the freezing rain, feeling the water run down his felt hat and soak the collar of his shirt. He hopped the stone wall with agility, stepping into the slippery mud of the neighboring lot. The stone cottage was completely dark, silent as a grave, but he knew she was inside, likely awake, fighting a war against her own demons. With the utmost care to avoid making noise, Heitor didn't leave the flower in the middle of the garden. He walked to the rotting wooden porch, knelt under the small overhang that shielded the front door from the rain, and placed the pot of red gladiolus exactly in the center of the braided straw mat, so it would be the first thing she saw upon opening the door. He left no note, nor did he sign his name. The vibrant red of the flower, cutting through the grey darkness of the storm, would be the deep, firm voice telling her she wasn't alone in that trench. He returned to his house soaked, his hands soiled with mud, and his heart beating with a purpose he hadn't felt in months. The next morning broke pale, with low mist coiling around the trunks of the Fraser firs. Aurora woke from an exhaustive, fragmented sleep, lying on the living room floor where she had collapsed from fatigue the night before. The crumpled envelope was still clutched in her right hand. She felt her joints aching from the cold and her face swollen from the tears shed. Despair still weighed on her shoulders like an iron anchor, telling her the only way out was to flee again, pack her few clothes into a bundle, and disappear into the woods before her brother arrived. Driven by an automatic survival instinct, she unbolted the front door to check if the dirt road was clear. When the wood groaned and the door opened to the freezing morning air, her eyes fell to the porch floor. The clay pot with the red gladiolus was there, perfectly sheltered from the rain, raising its sword-shaped leaves like a soldier standing guard at the door of her ruined castle. The impact of that sight was like an electric shock running down the lonely woman's spine. She fell to her knees on the damp porch, reaching out trembling hands to touch the red petals that carried tiny dewdrops. Her grandfather had taught her about the sword lily. She knew exactly what the watchmaker was telling her. He wasn't offering pity, he was offering strength. He was saying he had noticed her war and was there, standing as a shield of readiness on the other side of the wall. Aurora hugged the pot to her chest and buried her face in the long leaves. For the first time since she had read her brother's letter, the sob that escaped her lips wasn't one of panic, but of relief, so profound it seemed to wash the grime from her soul. She didn't need to flee. She didn't need to run into the woods like a hunted animal. There was someone there who, even without ever having heard the sound of her voice, was willing to stand by her side against the storm. The silent decision formed in her wounded heart. She would fight for that piece of land. She would fight for the garden that was being reborn. And if you're feeling your heart warm up seeing hope return to this woman the world tried to silence, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the Tales of Yesteryear channel, as it helps us continue bringing these stories of overcoming, love, and healing through time. The weeks that followed transformed Mist Valley. September arrived, bringing the spring of 1924, and with it, the miracle that Heitor and Aurora had built in absolute silence. The old floral clock had resurrected in all its botanical glory, becoming a marvel of natural precision that defied any metal mechanism Heitor had ever fixed. The dynamic between the two neighbors had evolved from distant respect to an intimate choreography of shared labor. They no longer needed staggered schedules to avoid seeing each other. Now, they worked in the garden at the same time, separated only by a few meters of tilled earth. The golden dawn light revealed the flawless operation of the garden. Punctually at 6 in the morning, the blue morning glories bloomed in the eastern quadrant, opening their delicate petals to the dew. Around 10 o'clock, the white and luminous stars of Bethlehem awoke, covering the ground with a carpet that resembled the frost that had long since departed. At noon, the sweet scent of passion flowers announced the peak of the sun, while at 4 in the afternoon, the 4 o'clocks painted the end of the workday in red and yellow. The clock was working, marking not the heartless passage of time that takes people away, but the patient time that makes life grow again. In these mornings of shared work, moments of indirect flirtation warmed the freezing mountain air. Heitor had taken to leaving his empty coffee cup on top of a flat stone, and Aurora, with light steps and downcast eyes that couldn't hide a small half-smile, would walk over with the steaming kettle to refill it. She got close enough for him to smell the lavender in her hair, tied in a loose braid, and for her to see the fine lines of concentration around his dark eyes. No words were exchanged. The sound of hot coffee hitting the ironware, the clink of the spoon, the sound of the wind in the pine needles, it all formed the private symphony of a true love in development, a pure feeling that struck roots as deep into the earth as the flowers they tended. Heitor's grief, the searing pain of his recent widowhood, had become a gentle and respectful longing, gradually replaced by the urgent desire to see the hazel eyes of his neighbor shine at every new sprout that was born. He realized he loved the woman of the stone cottage on the day she pricked her finger on a rosebush thorn, let out a mute gasp, and instead of hiding, sought his eyes for comfort, instinctively reaching her hand toward him. Heitor had cleaned the trickle of blood with a clean cotton handkerchief he pulled from his pocket, holding her rough fingers with a delicacy that made time stop for a whole minute. While peace flourished on the mountain, the truth about Aurora's past reached Heitor's hands through indirect means. Mrs. Celeste, the shrewd housekeeper who had for weeks observed the change in her employer's behavior and the birth of this unlikely romance, had taken a trip to the nearest town to fetch supplies and order new lenses for Heitor's glasses. At a local tailor shop, while waiting to be served, she found a pile of old newspapers and magazines from the capital that the owner used to wrap packages. The old housekeeper's eyes stopped on a faded photograph on the page of a cultural supplement dated 5 years ago. It was Aurora's face, the same woman, but with a radiant expression, wearing a silk dress and pearls around her neck, standing on the stage of the Academy of Music. The sensationalist headline spoke of the scandal of the missing soprano, detailing Vincent's gambling debts, and the suspicion that he had tried to sell her into marriage to a violent waterfront mobster. Mrs. Celeste bought the magazine for a few cents and carried it hidden back to Mist Valley. That same night after dinner, the housekeeper placed the magazine in Heitor's hands while he was cleaning his tools in the library. The watchmaker read the entire report standing up, feeling his jaw lock and the muscles in his neck turn rigid as steel. With every line describing her brother's cruelty and the exploitation of that woman's voice, Heitor felt a protective, volcanic rage erupt in his chest. He finally understood. She wasn't a woman touched in the head. She was a war survivor. Her silence wasn't a handicap. It was a protest. It was the absolute refusal to surrender the most valuable thing she possessed to people who only wanted to consume it. Heitor folded the magazine, tucked it into his desk drawer, and turned the key. He wouldn't tell her he knew about her past. He wouldn't violate her safe space by bringing up the ghosts of the city. On the contrary, the discovery only cemented his resolve. He loved the woman of the present, the woman with dirt under her nails and the scent of coffee, and if the past tried to drag her back, he would use every ounce of his fortune and influence to destroy anyone who dared touch a hair on her head. And the past didn't take long to arrive, announcing itself with its peculiar violence. There were only a few days left until the end of the month, when the peace of the floral clock was brutally shattered. It was a Thursday afternoon. The 4 o'clocks were beginning to open their reddish petals, signaling the end of the day, when the noise of 2 powerful engines tore through the valley's stillness. Aurora was in the center of the garden, watering the white clover seedlings, while Hator was on his own land, chopping wood with an axe near the stone fence. The harsh sound of tires crushing the gravel of the road made Aurora's blood freeze instantly. She dropped the zinc watering can on the ground, the water spilling across the clean earth, and turned toward the front of the property. 2 black Model T Fords, covered in the reddish dust of the mountain road, jerked to a stop in front of the stone cottage. The doors slammed with a bang. From the first car, Vincent stepped out. He was older than Aurora remembered. His once dark hair was now thin and grey at the temples, his face was bloated from alcohol and excess, and his expensive pinstripe suit was grimy at the cuffs, exuding the decay of a desperate man who gambled everything and lost. Behind him, a middle-aged man in a strict grey overcoat stepped out, carrying a black leather satchel and a notepad, the asylum's evaluating doctor. From the second car, 2 burly men with hard features emerged, hired thugs brought to ensure the job was done by force if persuasion failed. Vincent kicked the rotting wooden gate open, sending it crashing off its rusted hinges, and stepped heavily onto the land, crushing the morning glory sprouts without even looking down. He stopped a few feet from Aurora, taking a foul-smelling cigar from his mouth and spitting onto the freshly cleared soil of the floral clock. Aurora took faltering steps backward, absolute terror overflowing from her wide eyes. She brought both hands to her throat, as if trying to protect the voice she hadn't used in years, her entire body shaking like an autumn leaf caught in a gale. The nightmare was materialized before her, soiling the sacred earth she and Hator had healed with such sacrifice. Vincent opened his arms in a theatrical, loathsome gesture, displaying a yellowed smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. He spoke loudly, completely ignoring his sister's humanity, addressing the doctor who accompanied him, saying the doctor could see with his own eyes the deplorable state in which the poor woman lived. He lied with the fluency of a professional con artist, claiming his sister had gone mad, that she lived in filth, mute as an irrational animal, and that she had no mental capacity to manage lands that were now worth thousands of dollars because of the railway passage. The doctor nodded with an expression of boredom, opening his notepad and beginning to scribble words that would decide the fate and freedom of an entire life, based solely on the accusation of a greedy relative. Her brother took another step toward Aurora, pulling a folded document from his jacket's inner pocket and a fountain pen. The tone of his voice shifted from theatrical phoniness to a sibilant, cruel threat. Vincent demanded she stop the mute woman act and sign the power of attorney immediately, transferring the lands to his name. He warned, with teeth gritted in suppressed rage, that if she didn't sign that paper the easy way, the 2 men in the car would strap her into a straitjacket, toss her in the trunk like luggage, and commit her to the worst asylum in the state, where her silence would be treated with ice baths and electric shocks until she forgot her own name. The blackmail was clear, dirty, and implacable. Aurora's breath became short and shallow. She felt the world spin around her, and her legs began to give way. The feeling of crushing helplessness threatened to drag her into the dark. The trauma was about to win. But before Aurora's knees hit the ground, a dull thud echoed through the garden. The heavy woodsman's axe buried itself with terrifying violence into the trunk of an old dead pine, just a few feet from where Vincent stood. The noise made her brother jump back, startled, letting out an involuntary curse and dropping his cigar in the dirt. The doctor stopped writing instantly, adjusting his glasses on his nose with trembling hands. The two thugs got out of the car, their hands reaching inside their coats. Hayter didn't hop the wall. He walked, with the lethal calm of an approaching storm, opened the small iron gate that separated the two properties, and stepped onto Aurora's land. He wasn't dressed like the amateur gardener of the mornings. Alerted by the sound of the engines, the watchmaker had changed out of his work clothes. He wore his three-piece suit, crafted from the most expensive English wool money could buy. A solid gold pocket watch, held by a gleaming chain, shone against his dark vest, and his perfectly polished Italian shoes stepped with absolute firmness onto the earth. The difference in posture between the two men was striking. Vincent was the image of despair, masquerading as authority. Hayter was the incarnation of silent power, a man whose wealth and influence were as real and dense as the mountain fog. With slow, measured steps, Hayter walked to Aurora. He didn't look at Vincent. He stopped exactly in front of the terrified woman, positioning his tall, broad body like an impenetrable wall between her and her family's malice. He looked over his shoulder, his dark eyes meeting Aurora's gaze. He didn't touch her, knowing she was at the limit of a sensory collapse, but gave her a slight nod, a gesture that conveyed the absolute security of the red gladiolus flower. "I am here. The war is mine now." Vincent, regaining some of his inflated arrogance, straightened the lapels of his dirty suit and demanded to know who the arrogant interloper was, interfering in family matters, threatening to call the local sheriff to arrest Hayter for trespassing. He mocked the neighbor, calling him a busybody hillbilly. Hayter pulled his pocket watch from his vest, snapped the gold cover open with a dry click that cut through the tense silence, checked the time with maddening tranquility, and tucked the jewelry back into his pocket. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep, polite, and bathed in pure ice. Addressing not Vincent, but the evaluating doctor, Hayter introduced himself using his full name and the name of his family's jewelry firm in the capital, a financial and commercial institution that anyone of means in the country knew and respected. The watchmaker calmly explained to the doctor that he was being an accomplice to a crime of fraud, warning that if a single comma was placed in that notepad attesting to his neighbor's insanity, Hayter would contact the Supreme Court the next morning, ensuring the doctor lost his medical license and ended his days in prison for perjury. The color drained from the doctor's face, and he snapped his notepad shut, taking 2 steps back, realizing he had entered a dogfight he wasn't paid nearly enough for. Turning his sharp eyes to Vincent, Hayter spoke with the tone of a man giving an order to an insolent subordinate. The watchmaker explained he was well aware of the man's gambling debts, the opera scandal, and the filth that ran through his veins. He warned that the Mist Valley lands would not be sold, expropriated, or negotiated with the railway under any circumstances. Hayter declared with unshakable firmness that he himself would cover the debt to the city's bookies if necessary, but that if Vincent or any of his thugs took one more step inside the floral clock, Hayter's lawyers would destroy his life until nothing but dust remained. The warning was clear, cold, and delivered with a civility that was far more frightening than screaming. Vincent looked from Hayter's impassive face to the cowering doctor, already walking back to the car. Her brother realized he had lost the advantage of surprise and isolation. Gritting his teeth in frustration, feeling the bitter taste of defeat in his mouth, Vincent pointed a trembling finger at Aurora, who remained safely hidden behind Hayter's broad back. The man threatened, ranting with a face red with hate, saying the battle hadn't ended there. He shouted that he would return at the end of that very week with the regional deputy and a court order signed by a bought judge, and that no amount of rich watchmaker money would be enough to stop the law from dragging the crazy woman off those mountains and destroying that filthy garden with the railway's shovels. Vincent spun on his heels, got into the car, slamming the door hard, and the two vehicles took off, kicking up a suffocating cloud of dust, leaving the valley behind with the aggressive sound of engines echoing off the slopes. Silence returned to the garden, but it was a heavy silence, impregnated with fear and tension. The threat hadn't been eliminated, only postponed. The clock was ticking, and the deadline had been set with brutal clarity. Hayter turned slowly to Aurora. The woman was leaning against the cottage's old stone wall, arms crossed tightly against her body, her teary eyes fixed on the dust cloud disappearing down the road. The sense of security they had built for months through cups of coffee and flower seedlings had been violated in a matter of minutes. Hayter took a step toward her, his stern expression giving way to deep vulnerability. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the valuable solid gold watch that had belonged to his father and grandfather, the most precious object of his existence. With a comforting slowness, Hayter walked to the nearest stone ledge, the same ledge where they used to exchange tools, and placed the open watch on the moss, dial facing up, relentlessly marking the seconds. He looked into Aurora's eyes and made the most important promise of his life without uttering a single sound. He handed his own time over to her. The dilemma was cast upon the freshly fertilized earth. Flee and abandon everything, or stay, face the demons of the past, and find the courage to have a voice again. The rhythmic ticking of the solid gold pocket watch, abandoned on the mossy stone ledge, seemed to be the only living sound in all of Mist Valley after Vincent's violent departure. Aurora remained motionless for a long time, eyes fixed on the jewelry gleaming under the pale late afternoon light. She knew exactly what that object represented. For a master watchmaker, a man who spent his whole life fixing other people's hands and who had fled the capital precisely because he could no longer stand the sound of time after his wife's death, handing over his personal watch was the greatest proof of devotion that could exist. It was an anchor thrown into her sea of despair. With slow steps and hands still soiled with earth, the woman approached the wall, picked up the gold piece, feeling the cold metal gradually warm against her palm, and pressed it to her chest. The mechanical beat throbbed at the same rhythm as her own frightened heart. She looked toward the neighboring lot, but Hayter had already gone into his house, granting her the space and silence necessary to make the most difficult decision of her life. The dilemma tore her soul in half. She could pack a suitcase with old clothes that very night and disappear into the mountain darkness, allowing her brother to destroy the floral clock and sell the property to the railway. Or she could stay, plant her feet in that earth fertilized with her own sweat, and fight alongside the man who had bled for her. That night, the Blue Ridge cold descended implacably, freezing the dew on the pine needles, but inside the stone cottage, a bonfire of determination began to crackle. Aurora sat before a small oval mirror with a peeling frame, lit only by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. She stared at her own reflection, observing the deep circles, the disheveled hazel hair, and the mouth that had remained hermetically sealed for 5 long years. Silence had been her shield against a world that saw her as a commodity, but now that same silence was the weapon her brother would use to commit her to an asylum and prove her supposed insanity. She brought her trembling hands to her own throat, feeling the thin skin and dormant muscles. She needed to reclaim her voice. Closing her eyes and focusing on the memory of the warm protection she felt when Hayter stood between her and Vincent, Aurora tried to emit a sound. The first effort resulted only in a painful hiss, a dry scratch that made her throat burn as if she'd swallowed sand. Panic tried to take over, whispering that the gift had died forever, but she opened her eyes, looked at the gold watch on the table, and tried again, once, twice, dozens of times through the night. A low, hoarse moan finally broke through the barrier of her lips, followed by a cracked, raspy syllable, sounding like the snap of a dry branch being stepped on. The sound was ugly, imperfect and physically hurt, but it was real. The seed of her voice had sprouted in the darkness. While Aurora fought her lonely battle before the mirror in the days that followed, Heitor didn't sit idly by, waiting for fate to knock on his door. The watchmaker knew that the woman's spiritual courage needed to be backed by an impenetrable legal and financial shield. At the first light of day, he put on his heavy overcoat, started the engine of his luxury car, and drove down the mountain toward the nearest town with a telegraph office. For 3 consecutive days, he monopolized the local telegraph operator, sending coded, urgent messages to his lawyers in Charleston, moving exorbitant sums of money through the Bank of the Republic, and ordering minute investigations into Vincent's creditors. Heitor was buying his unwanted brother-in-law's debts, transferring control of that loathsome man's fate directly into his own hands, the hands of a master watchmaker who knew exactly which gear to tighten to paralyze an enemy's entire system. In Mist Valley, the tension was palpable in the air, like the static electricity that precedes a massive summer storm. Mrs. Celeste, the loyal housekeeper, began baking sweet breads and preparing nutritious broths, leaving them on the stone wall to ensure Aurora was eating, noticing that the neighbor barely left her house and seemed exhausted. The floral clock in the yard continued its uninterrupted cycle. The morning glories opened early, the stars of Bethlehem shone under the midday sun, and the 4 o'clocks announced the evening. The garden was at its peak strength, a living testament to the healing that had taken place there. But everyone knew the deadline set by Vincent was coming to an end. The end of the week approached, and with it the promise of destruction. Heitor spent his afternoons walking along the property line, his dark eyes fixed on the dirt road, jaw tight, ready to turn his fortune into an indestructible barricade. He hadn't asked for his gold watch back, and Aurora hadn't returned it, keeping the silent pact intact. Saturday morning broke grey, with heavy clouds dragging across the mountain peaks and a biting wind that brought the metallic scent of imminent rain. And if you, like me, have a heavy heart, hoping justice is done and this garden of love isn't destroyed by greed, take a moment now to leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and comment from which part of the world you're sending good vibes to Aurora. At exactly 10 in the morning, the terrifying sound of engines tore through the valley again, echoing off the stones and silencing the birdsong. This time, it wasn't just 2 cars, but 3 vehicles that kicked up a thick cloud of dust, stopping abruptly before Aurora's cottage. Vincent climbed out of the first car, his face flushed and twisted in a smile of anticipated triumph. Accompanying her brother was the same evaluating doctor from the city, and this time a uniformed man with a sheriff's badge, sporting a thick mustache and an expression of impatience, holding a folder of stamped legal documents. 4 thugs stepped out of the last vehicle, bringing thick ropes and a grimy canvas straitjacket. They came ready for a hunt, treating the property owner like a dangerous animal that needed to be caged. Upon hearing the car doors slam, Heitor immediately stepped out of his house, his boots thudding on the lawn. He crossed the iron gate separating the lots, placing himself firmly in the middle of the path between the invaders and Aurora's door. The sheriff took a step forward, clearing his throat to deepen his voice, and addressed Heitor with arrogance. The local authority demanded the watchmaker move out of the way, warning that he held a temporary court order of incompetence signed by a circuit judge, allowing the removal of the patient Aurora for psychiatric evaluation in the city due to her state of mental alienation and severe muteness. Vincent laughed mockingly, spitting on the ground and telling Heitor that big city money didn't buy backcountry law, ordering the thugs to move forward and break down the cottage's wooden door. Heitor didn't retreat a single millimeter. His broad shoulders seemed made of granite as he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulling out a sealed envelope from the Bank of the Republic. With a voice as sharp as broken glass, Hayter informed the sheriff that the court order was based on the assumption that Vincent was the only relative capable of managing his sister's assets. However, the watchmaker revealed, handing the documents to the perplexed authority, that Vincent was technically bankrupt, with all his assets frozen, and that, as of the previous morning, Hayter had purchased all of the man's promissory notes and gambling debts. Hayter declared loudly that Vincent possessed no moral character, integrity, or financial standing to be anyone's guardian, as he himself would be arrested for fraud and embezzlement if Hayter so desired. Vincent's face lost all color, turning into a mask of pure terror as he realized the silent neighbor had excavated all his darkest secrets and exposed them there, in front of the police. Confusion took hold of the group of men, but the sheriff, trying to maintain some appearance of authority, argued nervously that, debts or not, the medical complaint still stood. The officer insisted the woman lived in a savage state, did not communicate, and needed to be taken to prove her lucidity before a medical board, again ordering Hayter to move. The watchmaker clenched his fists, preparing for physical confrontation if necessary, ready to use the woodsman's axe leaning against the nearby tree. But before any man could take another step, the sharp creak of rusted hinges cut through the air. The cottage's wooden door opened slowly. Aurora stepped onto the porch. She wasn't wearing the grey, dirt-stained dresses of her isolated days. She wore a navy blue cotton dress, perfectly clean and ironed, which had belonged to her past. Her hair was pulled back into an elegant bun, and her posture was so straight and imposing she seemed to have grown several inches. In her hands she firmly held Hayter's gold pocket watch. The woman walked down the garden's stone path, passing through the open 10 o'clock flowers, ignoring the thugs as if they were invisible, and stopped exactly beside Hayter. The warmth of her presence radiated toward the watchmaker, who looked at her with a mix of surprise and profound admiration. The silence in the garden became absolute. Vincent swallowed hard, intimidated by the aura of authority his sister emanated. The sheriff and the doctor took an involuntary step back. Aurora lifted her chin, looked directly into the uniformed officer's eyes, and, feeling the gold watch pulse in her hand, opened her lips. At first her voice failed, a raspy whisper lost in the wind. Vincent smiled ironically, opening his mouth to declare her insane. But Aurora took a deep breath, smelling the clean earth she herself had cultivated, and tried again. "Sheriff," she said, in a voice that was hoarse, deep, and surprisingly firm, echoing through the mountains like the sound of an ancient tree taking new root. "I am the rightful owner of these lands. I am in full possession of my mental faculties, and I demand you remove these trespassers from my property immediately." The shock was so brutal that the doctor let his leather satchel slip from his hands, hitting the damp earth with a dull thud. The sheriff's eyes widened, glaring at Vincent with an expression of hatred for being made a fool and dragged into a false report. Aurora didn't stop there. Turning her flashing gaze to her brother, she continued, each word sounding clearer and stronger than the last. She told Vincent that her silence wasn't a sickness, but a choice to avoid being contaminated by the rot he spread through the world. She warned him with an authority that made the man shrug his shoulders that he had tried to sell her once, and she had allowed fear to control her, but she would never flee again. Aurora declared that the Mist Valley lands would belong to the flowers and her grandfather's memory, and that if Vincent didn't vanish from her sight that very moment, she herself would make sure to testify against him in the city courts regarding the forged documents from 5 years ago. The power of her words, combined with the financial ruin orchestrated by Hayter, was the death blow. Vincent looked at the bankruptcy papers in the sheriff's hands, looked at his resurrected sister and the giant in the suit beside her. Without a single word in response, the defeated brother turned, stumbling over his own feet, got into the car, and ordered the driver to accelerate. The sheriff, extremely embarrassed, muttered a clumsy apology to Aurora, tipped his hat in a sign of respect to Heitor, and ordered his men back to the vehicles. In less than 5 minutes the dust settled, the engines faded in the distance, and peace returned to the garden. The storm had passed, and the floral clock had survived intact. When silence reigned once more, broken only by the timid song of a bluebird in a nearby fir tree, Aurora's legs finally gave way. The gargantuan effort of breaking her own trauma all at once drained her of all energy. She would have fallen to the ground if Heitor hadn't caught her. The watchmaker wrapped his arms around her waist, supporting her weight with a delicacy contrasting with the size of his hands. He helped her sit on the stone wall, kneeling before her on the fertilized earth, not caring about dirtying the wool of his fine trousers. Aurora's eyes met Heitor's. There were so many repressed words, so many years of unheld conversations. But at that moment, the silence between them was no longer a shield. It was a cozy embrace. She reached out, opening her palm to return the valuable pocket watch to its owner. Heitor placed his hands over hers, gently pushing the watch back toward the woman's chest. He shook his head, and with a voice thick with emotion and eyes shining with unshed tears, said that his time belonged to her now, and if she wanted, they would have all the days in the world to learn how to talk again. Aurora smiled, a genuine, luminous smile that erased all the shadows from her pale face. With trembling hands, she touched Heitor's face, feeling the rough texture of his stubble, and spoke his name for the first time. "Heitor," she whispered, her voice caressing the name like a prayer. "Thank you for taking care of my garden." The master watchmaker closed his eyes, leaning his cheek into her hand, and there, under the midday sun that illuminated the open flowers of truth and justice, they shared their first kiss. It was a soft touch, hesitant at first, but quickly deepening into the certainty of two souls who had crossed the hell of loss and found each other in the process of caring for one another. Love had taken root irreversibly. The years followed their relentless course, but in Mist Valley, time lost its cruelty and became a docile ally. The year was now 1932. The rustic stone cottage and the luxury mansion on the neighboring lot were no longer separated by a moss-covered stone wall. The barrier had been torn down, joining the two properties into a vast and stunning botanical estate that had become famous throughout the state of North Carolina. The old Linnaean floral clock, once just a forgotten circle of earth, was now the heart of a true empire of rare flower cultivation, attracting botanists and buyers from all over the country. The morning was sunny, with a sky of a blue so deep it looked like an oil painting. Aurora stood in the center of the garden, wearing a white linen apron over a light dress, her face protected from the sun by a woven straw hat. Her voice was now constant, melodious, and full of life, echoing through the yard as she gave affectionate instructions to Mrs. Celeste about which arrangements should be placed in the dining room for lunch. Behind her, firm, familiar footsteps approached across the soft grass. Heitor hugged her from behind, his large, experienced hands resting on his wife's waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. The sad widower of the past had given way to a radiant man, whose eyes smiled even before his lips did. Together, they watched the spectacle of nature surrounding them. The morning glories were in full display, painting the east in purple and blue, and the stalks of red gladioli swayed gently in the mountain breeze, eternally reminding them of the strength they found in each other. Aurora turned her head slightly, brushing her nose against her husband's face, and began to hum softly a gentle, ancient melody. She never returned to singing for the crowds of the great theaters in Charleston. Her precious voice was now a treasure reserved only for the flowers they grew, and for the man who had the patience to pull, with his own hands, every weed that smothered her heart. They had discovered that even when life cuts the roots of hope, true love is like the strongest seed in nature. All it takes is a little tilled earth, light, and someone willing to water it every day for the garden of the soul to bloom more beautiful than ever.